Hey, good morning or good evening or good afternoon, whenever this video finds you. We're going to be looking at John chapter 5, verses 1 through 15. And before we get into that, I was curious if any of you have ever been involved, and you can comment maybe on the video or email me, but if any of you have ever been involved in like a mob, not not like in Chicago, not like mobsters, but like a wild mob scene, where you're part of something like, like they show the videos of the Black Friday sales. Everybody's waiting outside the gate, and they open the gates, and there's just a wild mob that rushes to get that TV or whatever that kind of thing is. Or if you remember back in, I think it was '99, the World Trade Organization were in Seattle, and people were there protesting, and that's nothing new, but it turned into this wild mob scene, and people are running down the streets and looting, and it was a disaster. And I remember watching that with my parents and glad to be watching it from a distance. Um, I've shared with a number of you before. I was in the middle of a clash there in Palestine, and everybody's running, and we were on the street. At that point, we were walking towards where we saw stuff was going on. We had to go try to get to a taxi, and suddenly we hear the tear gas kind of come flying through, and then hundreds of people come running your way, and you join in. You just get running, get out of there, and you're part of this thing that you didn't, necessarily even want to be a part of, but there you are. Um, if you haven't been part of a wild mob, I'm not recommending it. But if you have, I'd be curious to hear your story. If you want to let me know, again, either comment somehow in the video, or just email me and let me know that. But the story where I'm going to be looking at today actually doesn't involve a wild mob, but it does involve people, in some sense, pushing their way to be first, and that's often what causes a lot of injuries for people in a mob scene, is that everybody's rushing, clambering to be first, to be safe, to be ahead of everybody else, in a sense, and others get pushed aside or pushed out of the way or pushed down even. And that's a really sad thing. And we're going to be seeing something similar to that. And I'm not about to call it a wild mob scene, if you already know the story we're going to be looking at. But it is a story where people are taking care of themselves, and perhaps leaving others behind. It's in a sense something that we've been seeing, obviously, with the panic buying people have been doing, and making sure that we are well stocked up, and whatever that may mean for others, that's their thing. I got here first, and that's a really sad attitude to have, and I think we all recognize that. But it's something that I think pops up here in the story too. I wanted to point out, but the story's in John chapter 5. So if you have your Bible, John chapter 5. And we'll be looking at verses 1 through 15. A reminder, I usually use New King James. That's just my preferred translation. Something that came out of seminary from one of my professors. I really appreciated that, and so I bought myself a New King James. So that's what I preach from normally, but you can follow along whatever translation you prefer to use. They should be pretty similar. But here we are, John chapter 5, starting in verse 1. It says, "After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, which is called in Hebrew Bethesda, having 5 porches. In these lay a great multitude. Great multitude often means hundreds, maybe even thousands of people, but certainly we're picturing hundreds of people. A great multitude of sick people, blind, lame, paralyzed, waiting for the moving of the water. For an angel went down at a certain time into the pool and stirred up the water. Then whoever stepped in first, after the stirring of the water, was made well of whatever disease he had. Now a certain man was there who had an infirmity 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he already had been in that condition a long time, he said to him, 'Do you want to be made well?' The sick man answered him, 'Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, but while I am coming, another steps down before me.' Jesus said to him, 'Rise, take up your bed and walk.' And immediately the man was made well, took up his bed and walked. And that day was the Sabbath. The Jews therefore said to him who was cured, 'It is a Sabbath. It is not lawful for you to carry your bed.' He answered them, 'He who made me well said to me, take up your bed and walk.' Then they asked him, 'Who is the man who said to you, take up your bed and walk?' But the one who had healed him, but the one who was healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, a great multitude being in that place. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you have been made well. Sin no more, lest a worse thing come upon you." The man departed and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. You may have picked up at this point Jesus' traveling pattern. He starts off in Cana, does the water to wine, and then to Jerusalem, clears the temple, does some signs, back, and then through Samaria to Cana again, which is where we were last week when he healed the nobleman's son. And then now we're back in Jerusalem again. And part of that pattern, the reason for that pattern going back and forth, is that Jesus keeps returning for festivals, Jewish festivals. So he was there for the Passover. That's when he cleared the temple. And now he's there for Sabbath celebration. And we're going to see this pattern again. I mentioned it. We'll get through this as we go through this book. But we see Jesus there. He's there, going to be there for the Festival of Lights, for Hanukkah, Passover, Sabbath, Purim, other things. And so Jesus keeps coming back to Jerusalem, and that's why he's there for the festivals. And he's there in particular during these festivals to reveal something about himself, something that the people didn't know, there to show himself fulfilling that festival, fulfilling that tradition, fulfilling the purpose of that tradition. He is the light of the world. So they're there at the Festival of Lights, and he is the light of the world. There is no greater light, even if you hang him up all over the city. He is that greater light. And so we're going to see as we'll get into next week what he is to the Sabbath here, and this is just the setup, verses 1 through 15, the setup for that story, for that thing. But that's what we see in John, as opposed to just going through like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and sharing miracles of Jesus. Jesus did this, then he did this, then he did this, and he traveled here and did that. What we have in John instead is carefully picked out miracles, which then we term signs. And the reason we call them signs, and John calls them signs, is because they come with Jesus's interpretation of them. So it's not just something that Jesus did that was amazing, it was that. But then Jesus himself will interpret what it was and why he did it, and the story will interpret. John will help interpret why that is, why Jesus did that, what it reveals of God. So these aren't just miracle stories, they're signs, they're revelations of God himself. And that's something we know Jesus came to do, was to reveal the Father. And he does that through these miracles, and then interpreting the miracle so we can see the purpose of it, so we can see the goodness of God through it, not just that he's powerful and able to heal, but also it says something about who he is, what his character is. And it also will say who Christ is in fulfillment of the types and shadows of the Old Testament, which I've talked about quite a bit. That's why in John we have signs, not miracles. These are going to be interpreted, and we'll get to that part next week, the interpretation of this sign. But just know that this is the third sign in, I just flashed 3, but you couldn't see it. There's 3. The third sign in John's Gospel that we're looking at here today. So again, let's start this off again in verse 1 and kind of pick it apart a bit. It says, after this, there was a feast of the Jews. So after Jesus has healed the nobleman's son in Cana, after this, there was a feast of the Jews. It was a Sabbath feast, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, which is called in Hebrew Bethesda, having 5 porches. So here's the sign, or this is the context, for the sign, which is where this is taking place. It's taking place in Jerusalem by the sheep gate. This is very near the temple, which is important. Again, we need to realize that the last time Jesus was in the temple, he cleared it and upset the religious leaders and everybody who was trying to, exchange the money and selling doves for the sacrifices and all those kinds of things. He cleared the temple and got everybody out of there, upset a lot of people, and then he left town. Now he's back in town. And so that's important. Story. And it's going to be important when we see their response to what he does here. But that's where we are. We're just near the temple there in Jerusalem. You'd think maybe he'd keep a low profile. I mean, he's God, but and Jesus is trying to reveal things, but is it wise to be rolling back into Jerusalem again and healing somebody? And especially on the Sabbath? Well, yes, that's why he did it. He chose the Sabbath. He was there just on the right day the right time for his very purpose. And we're going to get into that more next week. But here in verse 3, it says, in these pools and these porches lay a great multitude of sick people, blind, lame, paralyzed, waiting for the moving of the water. I don't know that we can really liken this to anything in our time. In war times, in war situations, there are field hospitals, just a big canopy with beds laid out, no partitions, really, no privacy. This would have been just an open air hospital, but no doctors, no nurses. So nobody's there, caring for these people. They're just there sick. Lots of them, a multitude of them. It would be a really sad and desperate scene to come across and to witness. I don't know if you've ever, either you yourself or been around somebody who's so sick or so in pain that they're groaning, and it's a tough place to be, and it's tough to be around, and to just have that many people, like I said, probably hundreds of people lying around there groaning, sickly, maybe even crying out now and then in pain, all kinds of various things people want to be cured of. But there are no doctors, no nurses, nobody's being tended to. They're just all kind of lying there waiting for the moving of the water. And here in verse 4, we're given an explanation of what that was really all about. It says, for an angel went down at a certain time into the pool and stirred up the water. Then whoever stepped in first after the stirring of the water was made well of whatever disease he had. So it's the old angel stirs the water fix that we're all so familiar with, right? This is a unique story. This is kind of like that was going on. But we do know that angels are real. We do know that angels minister to God's people. We have stories in the Old Testament and most certainly in the New Testament also about angels. They minister to Jesus himself. I mean, they announce his birth to the shepherds, right? They speak to Mary and Joseph. They speak to the wise men. They also are there ministering to Jesus after he's been tempted in the wilderness at the beginning of his ministry. They minister to him after that fasting and time of temptation. And then at the end of his ministry, right before the cross, he's there in the garden and in agony over what he's about to go through. And they minister to him there too. So we know that angels minister to God's people. So it's really not a shock, although it's kind of a strange story. Like there's an angel there stirring up water. It is a little different, but I'm not surprised that God would do something like that to heal people, to bring a blessing to people. We do see here in the story that this was something that only happened at certain times. Maybe it was only at the festivals. It doesn't say, but that's one thought that's out there, that maybe this only happened during Sabbath. Maybe this only happened during Passovers and these big festivals. Then God would send the angel, and that was a time when people would come and be a part of it. Maybe it was a Saturday only, or Saturday only sale. It's the only day the angel shows up. We don't know, but we know it wasn't something that you could just count on any day, every day. Hey, come on down to the pool and get healed. Certain times the angel would show up and stir that water, and people would be healed. Another thing I'd note is that it's unlikely that the angel was visible, but people could see the effects of the water being stirred up, and then they knew it was time to go in. If the angel was visible, you'd have all kinds of people showing up, right? Hey, there's an angel down at the pool, let's check that out. And so it wouldn't just be the sick and the lame, the paralyzed there. You'd have everybody in town going out for an angel sighting. And so it's probably just they would see the water bubbling up. Some people see this story as a superstition, and maybe not true. It is interesting that Jesus doesn't mention it here in the story. The man mentions it, and the narrator John mentions it, but Jesus doesn't pay any heed to it. It may have been a superstition of the people, but because we do know that there are kind of healing pools, baths in Europe. Those have been found for ages. People have gone to those, and even in this time, people had those kinds of places where there were minerals and things that would heal people of certain things in the water. So that's one of the explanations. But I think it probably was an angel, not just because it says it, but because it says it, but also because God uses angels to do all kinds of things, to minister to people. So even with those kinds of those other explanations, I think it still makes a lot of sense that indeed an angel was there, but probably not visible. They're probably just seeing the water bubbling up at certain times and going, ooh, now's the time. Let's jump in. It's also likely that this wasn't still occurring at the time that John was written. Otherwise, he wouldn't have had to give explanation. He would have been like, the pool in Jerusalem at the sheep gate, the old angel at the pool thing. But he has to explain it, because likely by this time that wasn't happening any longer. And my assumption about that is that, well, now Jesus has taken on that ministry of healing. This was they were kind of crossing paths here, and it was time for the angel to go find a new job, and Jesus would be taking over that ministry, as would his disciples, and then their disciples after them. So this is something that God probably had in place, kind of Old Testament sort of a thing, and then Jesus comes in, and he becomes the one who now heals people and takes over that kind of a ministry. But the stir stick angel had to find a new job, and but you had to be there just the right time, because it only happened at certain times, and then you could be healed. It says, now, verse 5, now a certain man was there who had an infirmity 38 years. That's when Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been in that condition a long time, he said to him, do you want to be made well? So this may have been the guy's whole life. It says 38 years rather than his whole life, or from birth. There may be some reasons for that we'll get into a little bit later here, but we know it's been a long time since this guy could walk. 38 years is a really long time, and I think what we're meant to get from that is not just that it necessarily was his whole life, but 38 years is a long time to suffer. A long time to suffer with an infirmity, whatever it may be. I know, some of us as a group have suffered through things for months and even for years, different things, and to kind of get used to, this is just life now, is a whole other level of suffering. When there's an end in sight, makes things different, and when you don't know, that takes on a whole new level, when that suffering is just going to be there the next day and the next day and the next day, and there's no end in sight. That's the condition of this man. For 38 years, he's been sick, and we know unable to walk. So then Jesus asks him what seemed maybe on the surface to be a silly question. He says, do you want to be made well? That's what he asks a guy who's lying down, who can't walk, and waiting at the angelic pool to be healed. Do you want to be made well? Like asking somebody, sitting there staring at an empty aisle right now in Costco, at the teepee aisle, ask them if they want toilet paper. Well, why do you think I'm here? Right? So the guy doesn't give a smart aleck remark, and that was probably wise, even though he doesn't know Jesus. But it does seem on the surface to be a silly question. Well, of course I want to be made well. Jesus is getting at something deeper, though, than just whether or not the guy wants to be healed. He's really setting this guy up for what he says to him later, I think, which is go and sin no more. And I think that Jesus is wanting to get at a much deeper level in the healing of your legs and your infirmity, but do you want to be made well from sin? And so that's that deeper level that Jesus takes people to. And so that's where I think the question is really headed. He's setting the guy up to be thinking about something much deeper than your legs. But that's where he starts with the guy, just as when he's talked to the woman at the well about living water. She's like, oh, show me this living water. It'd be great not to come after the well day after day. He's like, I don't think Jesus gave an eye roll, but like starting at this point with people and then leveling up, moving them up to a place of greater understanding, from the natural to the supernatural, from the earthly to the heavenly, and getting us there. So that's what I think he's doing with this guy. Do you want to be made well? And then as he talks to him later in the temple, he's gonna note to him, now go and sin no more, or something worse might happen. This is the kind of well that I want you to be, is free from sin. So Jesus came to, we know he came to do much bigger things than heal people of infirmities, but to heal us of our sin and to save us, from sin and death. Verse 7, the sick man answered him, Sir, so this is the guy's response. Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, but while I am coming, another steps down before me. So God, Jesus asked him, "Do you want to be made well?" The guy says, "Well, there's no one to put me into the pool. Of course, I want to be well." Um, Now, I'm not picturing this to be I brought up the wild mob and the mad rush, like a Black Friday thing. I'm not picturing or asking you to picture a Black Friday scene here, that the water stirs and there's a rush of sick, paralyzed, blind, lame people heading toward that same pool of water. But we do know, as it says, the first one in gets healed. And if we know anything about human nature, it's not. And Jesus had to come and teach, that the first will be last, the last will be first. Um, Teaching about humility, teaching about putting others first and their needs first. It doesn't come natural. What comes natural is, get me in that water, right? I want to see. I want to walk. I want to be well. I've got to be the first one in. And so everybody wanted to be the first one, because that's the person who gets healed. No point in being the second one, right? So maybe it wasn't a wild rush, a mad rush, but maybe it was. Maybe it was kind of a dirty scene sometimes where people are pushing ahead of others. That would make sense. That would jive with humanity and just what comes as our natural response to a lot of things. But Jesus says to him then, "Rise, take up your bed and walk." And immediately the man was made well, took up his bed and walked. So that's the miracle that we have. And as I said, we'll look next week at why we call this a sign, or John calls this a sign, rather than a miracle. It's going to be interpreted. There's going to be something deeper, the reason behind Jesus doing it. But for now, we can see that the man obeys Jesus' command and is healed. Much like the man last week was told, "Go now, your son lives." And so he left, and the son was healed right at that moment. And this man has obeyed, in this sense, taken a literal step of faith. He got up and walked, and he was able to walk. And if you haven't seen this, I encourage you to watch the Gospel of John movie. They did a movie. There are tons of Jesus movies out there, and some are better than others. The Gospel of John is probably maybe my favorite. I felt the acting was done really well, and it follows the Gospel of John really closely, and so I appreciate that also. But this scene is one of those things that for me visually is very powerful. I'm maybe a bit more of a visual learner in those ways, or at least experiencing. When I see things, it's much more than when I read it on the page. And when I see the acting of this guy getting up and using legs that haven't really moved in 38 years, the dust coming off his robe, all the details, all of that, it's powerful to see this man take a step of faith and be healed. It's a beautiful thing Jesus did there. But here's the reason why John chose this one. Jesus healed people left and right. We know this. Why did he choose this particular story? Here's the reason. He says, "Take up your bed and walk." And it says, "And that day was the Sabbath. The Jews therefore said to him who was cured, 'It is a Sabbath. It's not lawful for you to carry your bed.'" Verse 11, "He answered them, 'He who made me well said to me, take up your bed and walk.'" So this is why Jesus has done this on this particular day. He knows it's the Sabbath, and he knows he's breaking one of their laws. You can find these kinds of laws in Jewish writings called the Mishnah. And these are rabbinic writings. So the rabbis would write their interpretations of scripture. They would write them down. Sometimes they differ. They're really interesting to read, because you get there, well, Rabbi so-and-so says this. Well, Rabbi so-and-so says that. And they differ on things, and there's debate, but they really enjoy that about interpreting their laws. But the Mishnah is there in the case of the Sabbath. It's got, I think it's 39 restrictions, laws that they add in, where people are basically asking, okay, so it says, in Torah, that we're to do no work on the Sabbath. That we're to rest. It's a day of rest. So what does that mean? What does it mean, no work, no labor? Can I, they didn't mow the lawn, but can I, in our day and time, can I mow the lawn? Can I, can I make some food for the kids? What can I and what I cannot, what can't I do? And so the rabbis came up with these laws, and basically they were in 4 categories. One, there was a group of restrictions, 10 or so restrictions that basically say, don't make any bread. It's just restricting people, don't be making food on the Sabbath. 2, don't be sewing anything. So there's restrictions about you cannot untie a knot, you cannot tie a knot. Why is that there? Didn't want any people to be sewing stuff. They consider that to be work. The third one has to do with making leather products. So you're not to be curing and cleaning out animals and curing and all that kind of stuff. They don't want you making leather. And then the fourth one has to do with no building. And so you weren't allowed to build things, and you couldn't move things from one place to another to build stuff. So you can check that out also. I think Jeremiah, I want to say 17, mentions that you cannot go from one place to another. You cannot carry a load or a burden from one place through the gates of Jerusalem in particular. And so what this guy was doing would have fallen under that category, that fourth category, I think, of carrying anything from one place to another, especially there in Jerusalem, would have been breaking that law on the Sabbath day. So they were upset about that. So they point out that he's been breaking this law, and they want to know who it is that's done it. When he does then tell them that it was Jesus who did it, first he didn't know, and then he kind of knows who the guy is after this encounter, the second encounter. It makes sense, not in a way that's natural or good, but we see their response is they want to kill him. So Jesus has now healed somebody on the Sabbath, and their response is like, let's kill him. Well, why so quick to that? This is the guy that cleared the temple, and we let him he kind of got away with that one. Starts messing with the law now. He's a goner. We kill the guy. It's over. We're back in charge. People aren't, getting all excited about some guy's miracles and following him around. We'll be back in our rightful place as the leaders of this nation, and so they want to kill him. That's where we're getting to into next week. Verse 12, it says, then they asked him, who is the man who said to you, take up your bed and walk, so that we can take care of him. But the one who was healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, a multitude being in that place. So the guy didn't know. He didn't tell him. One point in the day, he's lying there, as he did every kind of a day, just lying around, unable to walk. Jesus comes and heals him. This guy, for all he knows, doesn't know his name, but comes and heals him. And then he just kind of tools around town for a little while. They buys an ice cream cone or whatever you do, tooling around Jerusalem there. And then Jesus meets up with him again later in the temple. And so I think Jesus very well knew he was going to encounter the guy again later that day. And he meets with him. It says in verse 14, afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, see, you have been made well. Sin no more, lest a worse thing come upon you. This takes an interesting turn, because Jesus has just healed a guy who hasn't walked in 38 years. It's a beautiful miracle. And now suddenly he's giving him a warning that could be taken even as a threat, that if you sin again, you're going to be toast. Like, you thought 38 years was bad of being an invalid, just lying around, not able to walk. You thought that was bad. Sin again, and it's going to get worse than that. So boy, what do we do with that? You can ask a ton of questions, and I kind of reserved that. I was going to share all those with you, but I'll let you think through that. But I think when we get down into next week's, we'll get into verse 29. And I think that's going to give us a real clue as to what Jesus was getting at here. Verse 29 says, do not marvel at this, for the hour is coming in which all who are in their graves will hear his voice and come forth, those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil to the resurrection of condemnation. Now, what's worse? Being unable to walk for 38 years, or being resurrected to condemnation, to eternal condemnation? So I think that's where Jesus is eventually going with this. With this guy, is go and sin no more. The sin itself, and that's one of those things that's maybe debatable. And certainly in the book of John, when John talks about sin, 9 times out of 10 he's talking about the sin of unbelief. That's what he's all about, is belief versus unbelief, light, dark. The light is belief, darkness is disbelief, sin is disbelief. I think that's the sin that he's talking about. at the end of 1 John. If you look that up, 1 John chapter 5, he talks about a sin there. And I think that's, again, John's interpretation of sin being just kind of in categories of belief and disbelief. And so if this guy continues in disbelief, if he responds to this miracle that's been done for him in disbelief, if he listens now to the religious leaders who are going to talk him down about it and say, you know what, this guy's a phony. Sure, you can walk, but he's doing this through the devil's power. He's not of God. Don't follow him. And if the guy goes, okay, now he's in a state of disbelief, and that is worse off than having been unable to walk for 38 years. So that's where I think Jesus is going with this. I just cut out some of the things to think about there, but you can do that on your own. It says here, and then in verse 15, the man departed and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. So there is now the setup for what we'll be looking at next week, which is Jesus's encounter with the religious leaders. It was the Sabbath that it happened. Now they know who did it. It's the same guy that cleared the temple. And who does he think he is? We're going to put him in his place. We're going to execute him. So that's their plan. We'll see as we get into next week also, when I talked about this whole Gospel of John really being like a court case, like a trial. And Jesus is on trial. And John calls his first witness, which is John the Baptist. And he comes and, if you will, says, behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And that's his testimony to the validity of Jesus' claim to be one with the Father. And then Nathaniel and Andrew give testimony. The woman at the well gives testimony to the men in the city. And the men of the city then give testimony and believe. And people are getting saved. The nobleman, his son is healed, and he now believes, and his whole household, and they're ready to give testimony. And so this is all building this case for Jesus is the Christ. He is Messiah. He is the Son of God. He is one with the Father. These false charges of blasphemy should be put away. So that's kind of the case. As we get into next week, we'll see their accusations against him, the prosecution, but we'll also see that the defense makes some accusations also, those being true. And so read ahead if you'd like. We're going to finish up chapter 5 next week. At least that's my plan. But I wanted to finish this up with a few different ways to go with this. But I got a perspective on this the other day that I thought I'd share. It's really about not the people who are in the story, but actually the people who are left out of the story. They remain nameless. We've got Jesus in the story. We've got religious leaders in the story. We've got the man who's an invalid in the story. We've got the blind, the sick, the lame, the paralyzed. They're in the story. We've got an angel in the story. But the ones who aren't in the story, I'll get to that. And the problem really for me is that they're not in the story. It says, Jesus asks the man, do you want to be made well? He responds, sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. Nobody is here to help me. Nobody. There's a great multitude of people here, and not one person around to get me into that pool. Now, those who are blind and those who are lame and those who are paralyzed, I wouldn't hold anything against them except if they push him aside to get into the pool. But we don't know that. But obviously people are getting in there ahead of him. But to think that here you are, picture the scene. We're in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. This is the epicenter of the religious world. This is the place. This is the home of the Jewish temple, where the sacrifices for sin are being made, where the priesthood is. This is as religious as it gets. And you've got perhaps hundreds of people lying around sick, lame, at this pool, hoping to be healed. And there's nobody there to help this man. That saddened me. And I don't want to dig too deep into the story because we don't have all these details. Maybe there was somebody helping other people in, maybe that's why he never got in, because there's somebody helping, the blind person to try to get in first. Maybe there were some what we now call good Samaritans there helping. But But this man wasn't receiving any help, and that saddened me to see that perspective, that there was nobody there. And this man is suffering. He's suffering alone, and nobody there to help him. And so these are the kinds of moments, anyway, that it made me think. These are the kinds of moments where Christianity can shine true light into the darkness. What we spend a lot of our time doing is trying to convince people with our words and with social media arguments and with books. And I don't, and I'm part of that, and so I don't say there's no place for that at all. But it has its place. But we spend so much of our time trying to shine light by convincing people that we're right, either about our doctrine or about our practices. And really, it's these kinds of moments that shine a greater light. If you were to name or ask anybody on the street, say, if they were to interview anybody on the street, name, the greatest Christian in the last 100 years. They're likely not naming book writers or pastors, or most people are going to think of, I would say, Mother Teresa. I would say Mother Teresa because she is known for being the person, if you will, to help people into the pool, to be there for this very group, the sick, the lame, the paralyzed, the blind, the lepers. She and others were willing. Others were working with her, of course. It's her name that's remembered. Jesus remembers the names of everybody else. But she's kind of the head of this movement of shining light in dark places and going where no one else is willing to go, and helping people when there's no one else willing to help. So that there are people who can now say, people in India and other places who can say there was someone willing to help me, not into a pool, but someone willing to help me when I was sick. They came and they fed me. They cared for me. They dressed my wounds, and shine light into dark places. And so that's really what we know we're called to do. And thinking about that, I thought, well, here we are, of course, with this coronavirus, this pandemic, and everybody's it's changing every day, and the numbers of those who are dying is just off the charts now. I think it's over 10,000 now worldwide today, as of Friday, March 20th. And those numbers keep rising, and so the restrictions are, things are tightening and tightening and tightening, and then it makes people wonder, well, what do I need to do? What do I need to do for my family? What do I need to do for myself? I've got parents who are in their 80s who have been on lockdown in their house for 2 weeks, just to self-quarantine, just to keep themselves from picking this stuff up, because they're definitely vulnerable to it, not just their age, but diabetes and heart disease and everything, and lung issues, and so they definitely be vulnerable to this. And I know we have people in our fellowship too that would be vulnerable to this, especially vulnerable, that we need to see protected. But it makes me think, what can we be doing? And I'm looking for feedback on this, okay? Because I don't pretend to have all the ideas around here, to have all the vision. But what can we be doing for our community, for the people in our fellowship? Obviously, I know some of the ideas I've seen are shopping. Some churches, they've got people who will go out and do the shopping for people who are more vulnerable, who shouldn't be out. And that's one way that we could act and respond. What else can you guys think of? I'm really curious. What can we do? Because this is one of those moments where we have opportunity to shine. And for whatever reason this virus is happening, we know, what we do know about God is that he can work all things for the good, and even something that's even a plague or something terrible, he can use his people to shine brightly. And so this is our opportunity, and so we do to be those who will metaphorically help people into the pool. So at the end of this, people can say, the church were the ones who were there. And I know there are other responders who aren't believers who are responding around our community. and shining light. God is using them to shine light. But certainly, if anybody should be shining light, it would be God's church. So what can we do? I know we've got to think of our families and think for ourselves, and what do we need to do to stay safe. But at the same time, also considering how can we be of help to others and be a blessing. So be brainstorming, be praying. Get back to me if you would with comments, emails. You can text me 360-477-8113. Now's the time for us to be thinking. We've got at least a few weeks. I know we're not going to be meeting as a fellowship, not in person. And I think this gives us opportunity really to maybe have more discussion, though it may come virtual this way, online and through that, but more so than we perhaps would in an hour and a half meeting time on a Sunday, to be able to say, okay, what can we be doing? Let's talk about this. Give me some ideas, and I look forward to seeing what you do. I'd love to on the other side of this whole thing, to be able for us to point at what God did through us, that we weren't just simply hunkering down, but those who can or are able to be able to jump in and be light bearers in the darkness and be those helping people in the pool. So get back to me with those ideas if you would. Thanks for watching today. I think this will probably be up on our website, maybe up on Facebook. I got to find some ways to get this out there. I may even get it up to YouTube, but I appreciate also some feedback just on the video and how it works, doesn't work. Am I loud enough? The background too blah? Is my face too close? Whatever it is, I'd appreciate some feedback. This is new for me as it is for you. But we may have to get used to it here for a little while. So get back to me. Just want to again say I love you guys and God bless you. We are praying for you. We had a prayer meeting just last night on the 19th online through Zoom. If you want to be a part of that, let me know. I'll get you details on how to do that, how to join us for that. Our prayer rules will still apply, keeping things confidential. So I need everybody to be in agreement with that who wants to participate. But I'm excited in some ways about what God's going to do through this, and how the church really has opportunity to show ourselves to be the church, more than a building, more than a set of doctrines, more than a voting block to some people, but actually those who are sharing the grace and light in tangible ways of Jesus Christ. So thanks for being who you guys are. Thank you for the way that you already do these things, and I look forward to what you'll come up with next.